This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so LifeLock wants to remind you to update your passwords. Using the same password across multiple accounts makes you vulnerable to cybercriminals. For comprehensive identity theft protection, let LifeLock alert you to anything suspicious and fix any issues. Start protecting your identity today with a 30-day free trial at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. In the heart of 1950s Manila, the bustling capital of the Philippines, life moved at a frenetic pace. It was a time of recovery from the ravages of war, with American influence still felt in the architecture, politics, and the streets teeming with jeepneys, a vivid legacy of World War II vehicles repurposed as public transport. Amid the swirl of rebuilding and post-war optimism, there lurked in the shadows remnants of old-world fears. Beliefs that had long held sway in the islands. Catholicism, brought by the Spanish centuries before, dominated the religious landscape. But beneath its official dogma were deep currents of indigenous spirituality, animism, and stories of demons, spirits, and witchcraft that had never been fully exorcised. It was in this particular intersection of modern belief and old-world superstition that the story of Clarita Villanueva unfolded, a young woman whose inexplicable torment would grip the imagination of the nation and send ripples of fear far beyond the Philippines. In a country already wrestling with its identity between East and West, between science and superstition, the events surrounding Clarita would force an uncomfortable confrontation with the unknown, the irrational, and the utterly terrifying. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Possession of Clarita Villanueva. Clarita Villanueva's early life was emblematic of the hardships faced by many Filipinos in the post-war years. Born in the province of Bacolod on the island of Negros in the late 1930s, she knew only poverty and struggle. Her mother was a practitioner of a local form of folk healing, a mangkukulam, whose reputation teetered on the edge of witchcraft. Clarita had grown up in a world where the line between traditional medicine and the supernatural was often blurred. Her mother's death when Clarita was in her early teens left her adrift, and by the time she reached 18, Clarita had made her way to Manila, like so many before her, in search of a better life. But for Clarita, Manila did not offer salvation. The big city, with its promises of opportunity, quickly revealed its dark underbelly. Finding no work, no shelter, and no community to call her own, Clarita wandered the streets. It was a common tale. Provincial girls arriving in Manila with dreams, only to find themselves destitute and prey to the city's vices. Soon enough, Clarita had fallen into the world of petty crime and street hustling. By the spring of 1953, she was picked up by the Manila police, charged with vagrancy, and thrown into Bilibid prison, one of the city's oldest and most notorious jails. At Bilibid, Clarita should have been just another face among the nameless thousands who passed through the prison gates. But almost immediately, something began to happen that would set her apart and plunge her into a nightmare that no one could have foreseen. It started with screams. Clarita, locked in a cell with other female detainees, began to thrash wildly in her sleep, shrieking in terror. The other prisoners, hardened by their own difficult lives, at first were able to ignore her. But the intensity of her nightly fits grew with each passing day. She spoke of invisible creatures attacking her, biting her skin, clawing at her body. Her fellow inmates saw her convulse, her limbs jerk violently, and her voice grew guttural and animalistic. Worse still, they saw something no one could easily explain. Deep bite marks appearing on her flesh as though gnawed by something unseen. The jail guards were called to intervene, but they too were at a loss. By day, Clarita was coherent, scared and shaken, but lucid. She spoke of two entities that haunted her. One, a large, dark figure, cloaked and menacing, and the other, smaller, but no less terrifying, both of whom came to her in the dead of night. They bit and scratched her, leaving marks that could not be explained. The bite wounds were clear for all to see, raw and bleeding, yet no one could see the creatures who inflicted them. Soon the prison's warden, Lieutenant Colonel Mariano Martinez, found himself face to face with the terrifying enigma that was Clarita Villanueva. Martinez, a pragmatic man, wasn't one to indulge in stories of the supernatural. But when he personally witnessed the deep bite marks appear on Clarita's skin without any apparent cause, even he was forced to admit that something beyond the natural world was happening within the confines of Bilibid prison. The prison's infirmary could offer no explanation. Doctors examined the girl and were baffled by the clear evidence of wounds, yet unable to identify a source. As news of Clarita's torment spread, so too did the panic. Rumors circulated within the prison walls, whispers of a curse, of evil spirits, and of the possibility that Clarita herself had inherited some dark power from her mother, the healer whom many suspected of being a witch. Some prisoners even began to refuse to share a cell with her, fearing that her curse might spread. Outside the prison, the strange events at Bilibid quickly became the talk of the town. Manila, like most of the Philippines, was no stranger to supernatural stories. Tales of aswangs, or shape-shifting demons, and other monsters had long been part of the cultural fabric. But this was different. This wasn't a story told by some old woman out in the provinces. This was happening in the heart of Manila to a young woman in a modern prison. The sensation grew, fueled by breathless newspaper reports and a public increasingly obsessed with the idea of demonic possession. Among those who heard of Clarita's plight was the mayor of Manila, Arsenio Lacson, a former journalist and a figure known for his tough, no-nonsense approach to leadership. Lacson, who had little patience for superstition, was nevertheless concerned by the growing panic. The last thing he wanted was for the city's already overburdened institutions to be thrown into chaos by rumors of demonic forces at work in Bilibid. And yet, like everyone else who had encountered Clarita, Lacson found himself unable to simply dismiss the stories. Desperate for a solution, Lacson turned to Reverend Lester Sumrall, an American Pentecostal missionary who had been working in Manila. Sumrall, a man of deep religious conviction, had a reputation for confronting the forces of darkness, having performed exorcisms in other parts of the world. With the backing of Mayor Lacson, Sumrall agreed to meet Clarita.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so LifeLock wants to remind you to update your passwords. Using the same password across multiple accounts makes you vulnerable to cybercriminals. For comprehensive identity theft protection, let LifeLock alert you to anything suspicious and fix any issues. Start protecting your identity today with a 30-day free trial at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
The encounter between Sumrall and Clarita Villanueva would become the defining moment of the entire ordeal. Sumrall, deeply rooted in his faith, approached the situation with a confidence that both unsettled and reassured those who witnessed the unfolding events. The young girl, emaciated and clearly tormented, was brought before him. Almost immediately, Clarita's demeanor shifted. She writhed and snarled, her face contorted in what seemed like a grotesque mask of rage. Her eyes, once pleading, now burned with a strange, unsettling intensity. Sumrall stood firm, calling upon the power of Christ to expel the demons that had taken hold of Clarita. It was a scene that wouldn't have felt out of place in a medieval church, an exorcist confronting the powers of hell itself. As he prayed, Clarita's body convulsed, and her voice, again growing deep and guttural, taunted him. She spoke in languages she had no knowledge of, cursed him, and screamed that she would never be free. For hours, Sumrall continued the exorcism, invoking the name of Jesus Christ and demanding that the demons leave Clarita's body. At the height of the ritual, Clarita let out an ear-splitting scream and collapsed, her body limp and drenched in sweat. Sumrall declared that the demons had been successfully driven out, and slowly, Clarita began to stir. When she finally opened her eyes, she was calm, exhausted, but seemingly at peace. The bite marks, which had appeared on her skin during the exorcism, began to fade. Word of the exorcism spread quickly, and for many in Manila, the case of Clarita Villanueva was proof of the ongoing battle between good and evil, between the forces of God and the forces of darkness. The newspapers hailed Sumrall as a hero, and Clarita herself became an unwilling celebrity, her story the subject of endless speculation and fascination. But even as Clarita's torment came to an end, questions lingered. Was it truly a case of demonic possession, or had something else been at work? For those who had witnessed the events firsthand, there was no doubt that something supernatural had occurred. But skeptics pointed to the power of suggestion, the psychological impact of Clarita's traumatic upbringing, and the influence of the deeply ingrained superstitions that pervaded Filipino culture. Some psychiatrists who reviewed the case later suggested that Clarita may have suffered from a form of dissociative disorder or hysteria, conditions that could have caused her to believe she was under attack by invisible forces. The bite marks, they argued, might have been self-inflicted, though no one could explain how such wounds could have appeared so suddenly and without her seeming to come anywhere near touching herself. Others pointed to the collective hysteria that often accompanies cases of supposed possession, where the power of belief, both on the part of the victim and the witnesses, can produce seemingly inexplicable phenomena. And yet, for all the theories and explanations, there was something about Clarita's case that defied easy categorization. The bite marks, witnessed by dozens of people, including hardened police officers and skeptical doctors, could not be explained away so simply, nor could the sudden change in Clarita's demeanor following the exorcism. She was no longer the wild, tormented figure who had terrified her fellow prisoners and confounded the authorities. Instead, she became quiet, introspective, and withdrawn. After her release from prison, Clarita disappeared from the public eye, retreating into a life of anonymity. She never again experienced the demonic attacks that had once plagued her, and she never sought to capitalize on her brief notoriety. For Clarita, the ordeal had been a nightmare from which she was eager to escape. The story of Clarita Villanueva is, in many ways, a reflection of the Philippines itself, a nation caught between the old and new, between science and superstition, between the modern world and the ancient spirits that still haunt its jungles and villages. For a country that has long been shaped by colonialism, war, and foreign influences, the case of Clarita was a stark reminder that beneath the thin veneer of modernity, the old fears still lurked, ready to rise to the surface at the slightest provocation. To To this day, the demonic possession of Clarita Villanueva remains one of the most famous and most controversial cases of its kind in the Philippines. For some, it's a story of faith and redemption, proof that the forces of good can triumph over evil. For others, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of superstition and the power of belief to warp reality. But for Clarita herself, it was simply the darkest chapter of a life that had already been filled with more hardship than any one person should have to endure. And as the years passed, her story became legend, an enduring reminder of the strange and terrifying things that sometimes lurk just beyond the edges of our understanding. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and you can listen to full episodes now on YouTube. Thanks again, and until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.